Our next speaker is Howard Coffin, and he's going to present the Vermont assault on Pickett's charge. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He is the author of 9 Months to Gettysburg, Stannard's Vermonters, and the Repulse of Pickett's Charge. He is a 7th-generation Vermonter with 6 ancestors who served in Vermont Civil War regiments. Mr. Coffin's book, his newest book, is called Something Abides, Discovering the Civil War in Today's Vermont, and it documents some 2,500 Civil War-related sites in Vermont. James McPherson wrote in the book's foreword, "Nothing like Something Abides exists for any other state. It is a tour de force." Long involved in battlefield preservation, Howard was a member of the Civil War Sites Advisory Commission and served on the boards of the Civil War Trust and the Association for the Preservation of Civil War Sites. Together, he and U.S. Senator James Jeffords preserved a 500-acre tract where the 1st Vermont Brigade made its heroic stand in the wilderness. It is now a part of the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. Additional published books by Mr. Coffin include Full Duty, Vermonters in the Civil War, The Battered Stars, and Guns Over the Champlain Valley. Please join me in a warm Sacred Trust welcome for Mr. Howard Coffin.
Can you hear me back there? Nice to be here. It was in 1968 that I first came to Gettysburg, knowing a little bit about the battle and not much about the terrain. And that first day I somehow blundered onto Cemetery Ridge and got out of my car and said, "This is not a ridge. I'm a Vermonter. Ridges go up and up and up." But I learned over the years it's quite a ridge, and I've been coming here ever since. And the experiences I have had. Several years ago, it was a summer night, and believe it or not, I was all by myself at the base of Little Round Top, down that slope, the 20th Maine charge. It was getting dark, and I looked up at the top of the slope, and there were lights there. And more lights, and more. And then they began to move down the slope, and they were all around me. They were fireflies. And then they moved off across the little valley up Round Top, about the number of lights, I would say, as Chamberlain had men. Last night I was on Cemetery Ridge up by the angle. Were any of you up there? It was a remarkable scene. The sun was going down. A golden light was shed upon the fields of Pickett's charge. And then as it began to get dark, summer thunder rumbled in the distance like distant cannon fire. Sad, glorious, mystical, this place of suffering, this place of great deeds, this great Gettysburg. It is a privilege to be here today. But that's not the business at hand here. The business at hand is Vermont and Pickett's charge. In the early summer of 1862, of course, the war was going badly for the Union. The Peninsula Campaign under George McClellan had been a disaster. Abraham Lincoln was down, as he was apt to be, but as usual he acted. And in July of 1862 he called for 300,000 troops to serve for 3 years. And then in August he called for 300,000 more troops, using a little-known law that allowed him to call the state militias into active duty for just 9 months. Vermont's quota was placed at 4,898 men, And that was a difficult number to meet. All the militia had already gone to war. Vermont had already sent 11 regiments off to war, including the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th regiments that made up the famous 1st Vermont Brigade. The last regiment that had gone off, the 11th, 1,500 men strong, a huge regiment. But somehow the trustees and selectmen and recruiters scared up 4,898 men, and they drilled briefly on the commons and greens of Vermont, and then they went down to southeastern Vermont, to the town of Brattleboro, to the great drill field, and there they met their commander, Brigadier General Edwin Stoughton, the youngest brigadier in all the Union armies, and within days they all hated him. He was a show-off. He dressed in perfect uniforms and rode a wonderful horse. His punishments were too strict, they said. They complained about his profanity, kind of a strange complaint for a soldier, at least in my days. And then on a hot Sunday afternoon, he marched them incessantly through the village of Brattleboro, and the men could see his primary purpose was to march them in front of these porches where beautiful young ladies sat. Oh yes, Edwin Stoughton, Brigadier Stoughton, was a ladies' man. At the end of October, they were on the train for Washington. Reaching Washington, they were assigned to the defenses of Washington under General Casey, and they were put out south of the city along the Occoquan River and Bull Run on patrol and on picket duty. It was nervous work for these new soldiers. Every once in a while they'd hear a shot in the night. But things generally went well until mid-November, when the skies opened and a foot of snow came down. Far more than they had back in snowy Vermont. And as was always true when the Vermonters came south with the armies, a lot of them got sick. They came from pristine Vermont. They did not have the immunities. Snow and sickness. But then big packages from home came down for Thanksgiving and Christmas, turkeys and pies. Why, the train service was better then than it is now. A couple of days from Vermont to the front lines. And then things got serious right after Christmas. On the 28th of December, word reached General Stoughton that Jeb Stuart and 1,500 Confederate cavalry were on the move north from Fredericksburg on what history would call the Dumfries Raid. Stoughton placed his men across the Little River Turnpike. Afternoon turned to night. 2 companies of the 12th Vermont under Captain Ora Paul were moved to the front, and soon they heard in the darkness the quick clop and jingle jangle of approaching cavalry. Paul ordered ready aim, and 3 heavy volleys rattled into the night. There was silence, some screaming and whinnying, and then the sound of cavalry going off into the distance. They had turned away Jeb Stuart. A small victory. Meanwhile, Edwin Stoughton set up his headquarters at Fairfax Courthouse, 3 miles from his main line. He invited his mother and sister to come down and join him in a fine brick house he appropriated, owned by a Dr. Gunnell. Then he set up a nice tent on the side lawn for a beautiful young lady from Boston. There were parties every night at the Gunnell house. Everyone was having fun. Stoughton escorted around Fairfax Courthouse a prominent young local lady named Antonia Ford. Did he know that she was a close acquaintance of Jeb Stuart? I don't know. Stoughton spent many of his weekends in Washington, and there he was on the arm of the daughter of New Hampshire Senator Hale. She also had another boyfriend, a young actor named John Wilkes Booth. All was going fine and happy for Stoughton until the night of March 9, 1863. Into Fairfax Courthouse rode 39 soldiers clad in blue, looking for Colonel Percy Wyndham, who had his headquarters in the village. However, they were told that Wyndham was off in Washington, and then they found out there was a bigger prize, a brigadier general in the village. The leader of this group of men went to Stoughton's house, said he had dispatches for the general. Up the stairs he went to Stoughton's room, and on passing the parlor he saw the piano, which had also come down from Vermont, covered with empty wine bottles. In Stoughton's room he made a noise. Stoughton did not respond. So he pulled back the cover from Stoughton, who was lying naked on his stomach, and slapped him. Stoughton barely roused. The man in the room said, "Have you ever heard of Mosby?" Stoughton. The man in the room said, "I am Mosby." John Singleton Mosby, the gray ghost of the Confederacy, and he got Stoughton out of bed, made him dress, although Mosby said he did it slowly. Mosby figured he must have been a fop. And off into the night they rode with the general and 50 horses and 39 men. Most of the men were soon released. But Stoughton was taken all the way to Richmond and Libby Prison, where he would be imprisoned for 6 weeks. By the time he came out, his health was ruined for good. He tried mightily to get his command back, but Abraham Lincoln found out, and his response was, "I can always make another brigadier general, but I sure hated to lose all those horses." To Fairfax Courthouse came the new commander of the 2nd Vermont Brigade, George Garrison Stannard, down from Vermont, former commander of the 9th Vermont Regiment. And the men instantly liked him. Nothing fancy about Stannard, a dusty old uniform, only 2 battered stars on the shoulders to denote his rank. No womanizing for Stannard. He brought his wife with him. And the men began to get drilled more, particularly more firing practice. And Stannard moved his headquarters down along the main line to Fairfax Station. Now the brigade's responsibilities were extended all the way down to the Rappahannock River at Rappahannock Bridge. And soon, as spring came to Virginia and the Vermonters marveled at the beauty of the scene, the flowers, the green grass, soon there was thunder from the south as fighting began in the east with the Chancellorsville campaign. The Vermonters heard it, and of course Robert E. Lee was putting a heavy licking on Joe Hooker. On the 9th of June, with summer weather on the land and the Vermonters sweltering, and getting within a month of the end of their 9-month enlistments, there was more fighting nearby at Brandy Station. The biggest cavalry battle of the war. By the time it ended, everyone knew Robert E. Lee was on the move to the west, headed over the Shenandoah Mountain, over the Blue Ridge Mountain to the Shenandoah Valley, and then north, off on his second invasion of the North to take the war out of his beloved Virginia. The 2nd Vermont Brigade got marching orders and they assembled at Union Mills, Northern Virginia. On the 25th of June, they were made part of the Army of the Potomac. of John Fulton Reynolds' 1st Corps, and they begin to march north, trailing the rest of the Union Army. On they move, crossing the Potomac at Edwards Ferry. Near Frederick, Maryland, some of the men encounter a very sad-looking Joseph Hooker riding south. He has been relieved of command of the Army of the Potomac. George Gordon Meade has taken over. Near Frederick, Maryland, Stannard issues a very controversial order. He tells his men in the 85-degree heat they cannot break ranks to get water. There's a revolt in the ranks. At least one officer, Stephen Brown, is arrested and deprived of his weapons. But Stannard relents on the order. The morning of July 1st, 1863, the Vermonters awaken near Emmitsburg, Maryland, and hear thunder to the north. The Battle of Gettysburg has begun. The 1st Corps is fighting in support of Buford's cavalry. The Vermonters move north up the Emmitsburg Road, and as they do so, 2 of their regiments are taken from them. The 12th and the 15th regiments taken from them and left by the wayside to guard artillery trains. So Stannard now only has 3/5 of his 4th, the 13th, 16th, and 14th regiments. On they move north, and they meet stragglers, civilians coming south as great clouds of smoke rise on the northern horizons. They march on, but they do not reach the battlefield until the fighting of July 1st is ended. The Vermonters almost make a tragic mistake. As they reach the battlefield, they veer to the west, marching for the Confederate lines. But a cavalryman sets them straight and gets them up on the Cemetery Ridge, where the Vermonters fall down and go almost immediately to sleep. They have marched 130 miles in 6 days, and they were not used to long marches. Now comes the morning of July 2nd. The Vermonters waken a blue sky morning, and they can see that they're in one fine mess. Obviously, this is a great battle. Across the little valley on Seminary Ridge, they see Confederate soldiers. All around them are thousands and thousands of Union soldiers, more coming in all the time. The Vermonters, now 9-month soldiers, not much confidence in the Army in the 9-monthers. They hadn't done much at Chancellorsville. The Vermonters are moved off Cemetery Ridge across Tawnytown Road to camp beneath Cemetery Hill. Well, they'll be protected from the artillery. A quiet day passes for them, more sleeping. And then at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, all hell breaks loose. Longstreet, with 18,000 men, has gone far to the south of the battlefield to begin an attack north along the Emmitsburg Road. The fighting commences at Little Round Top with Chamberlain's Stand, spreads to Devil's Den, the Valley of Plum Run, the Valley of Death, the wheat field, the peach orchard, and on it comes north until finally it grows late. The light is dimming, and the Confederates make one last try at cracking the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. Rand's Wright's Georgians, 1,500 strong, make that try, and Wright will penetrate deeper on Cemetery Ridge this day than anyone will the next. For one brief fall of time, as Shelby Foote said, everything seemed possible. But Winfield Scott Hancock reaches for soldiers he can find anywhere, and he calls up the 2nd Vermont Brigade. They reach the top of Cemetery Ridge as cannon is firing, smoke in the air, a great thunder of battle. Their first real battle, really. But they form line and fix bayonets and advance. By this time, Wright has seen the hopelessness of his situation and is in retreat. But Some Union cannon are being dragged away out into the Cadore fields, and Hancock asks the commander of the 13th Vermont, can you recapture those cannon? Francis Voltaire Randall replies, damn right if you'll let me. And out he goes, and his men recapture the cannon, and they're proudly dragging them back up Cemetery Ridge when an old soldier from another unit comes along and inquires, what state be you fellows from? The reply comes in unison from the Vermonters, we're Green Mountain boys. The old soldier says, I thought you must have been green or you wouldn't have gone out there. And then the Vermonters are under fire from a house on the Emmitsburg Road, and Company A of the 13th Vermont, under a wild Irishman named John Lonergan, goes to the Emmitsburg Road, surrounds the house, and comes back with 70 Confederate prisoners. Lonergan will win a Medal of Honor. How did he do it with 40 men? The Irish in Burlington don't like to hear this today, but the Confederates ran out of ammunition. Night falls on the battlefield. The 13th and 16th Vermont are placed along the main Union line, about 400 yards south of the famous copse of trees. The 16th Vermont is sent on Pickett detail way out by the Emmitsburg Road. Scary business. Francis Clark, a lieutenant with the 16th, was on picket duty that night. He came from the Bridgewater Hills, Daly Hollow, and he rode home of that night. Here and there the moon revealed, amid the trampled grain, prostrate forms whom no long roll or reveille could rouse again. The air was tremulous with a sound, low and almost indescribable, resembling a far-off and just audible moaning of a forest of pines. It was the groaning of the wounded swelling up from field and wood and blending for miles in one low, inarticulate moan. After a fruitless search for water, I wrapped myself in my blanket and, with the wounded on either side, lay down to sleep. With upturned face to the mild majesty of the Queen of the Night, as she looked down calmly upon us, and with fleeting thoughts of home and friends and other times, breathing a prayer, I fell asleep. The morning of July 3rd, 1863, dawned clear and warm, a bit of fog down on the fields. Soon after the sun came up, some Confederate cannon were rolled forward from Cemetery Ridge and fired a few shots the Vermonters' way, and one of them hit a caisson, exploding artillery ammunition, and several Vermonters were killed and wounded. As a result of that lucky shot, lucky for the Vermonters or for the Confederates, I'm not sure, the 13th and 16th Vermont regiments, a total of about 900 men, were moved about 60 yards forward of the Union line down into a ravine where they would have protection from future explosions. There they lay through the warm morning, the 16th still way out by the Emmitsburg Road. The day grew hotter. A Confederate soldier remembered, never was the sky or earth more serene, more harmonious, more aglow with light and life. And then at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, once again, the world exploded. The Confederates brought artillery out of the trees on Cemetery Ridge and opened fire. The Union replied, and a great duel of 250 guns commenced, back and forth across the mile-wide valley. Colonel Vasey went out to check on his 16th Vermont. and he found to his amazement that every man was sound asleep. Why? Well, they were tired out from marching 130 miles, and I suppose they were just blanking it out. They'd never been in any situation like this. Meanwhile, of course, in the trees off behind Seminary Ridge, Robert E. Lee had been massing some 10,500 men to assault the Union center. He had tried the Union right without success. He had tried the Union left without success. And now the try would be at the middle. The aiming point, the copse of trees. Usually before an attack like this, Lee would ride along the lines of his men, and they would cheer him, and he would remove his hat in salute. But today, the Confederates were told, no cheering. You may remove your hats to him, no cheering. And so Lee rode along those lines, and the men took off their hats in salute. And Shelby Foote wrote of that moment, the sunlight in his gray hair making a glory about his head. Oh, to have written that line. And then they came. Out of the trees on a mile-wide front, beginning to march across the mile-wide valley, flags to the front, drums beating, officers on horseback shouted commands, the sun glinting on musket barrels, rifle barrels, and swords. On they came as if marching perfectly. Confederates seldom did that. Up on Cemetery Ridge, there was a Vermonter, Franklin Aretas Haskell, out of Tunbridge, Vermont, who was serving in the Iron Brigade. He'd gone west before the war. He wrote a 60-page letter to his brother about the battle, and he described the assault as thus. The enemy is advancing. Every eye could see his legions, an overwhelming, resistless tide of an ocean of armed men sweeping upon us, regiment after regiment, brigade after brigade. The red flags wave, their horsemen gallop up and down, the arms of 18,000 men, barrel and bayonet, gleam in the sun, a sloping forest of flashing steel. Right on they move as with one soul, in perfect order, without impediment of ditch or wall or stream or ridge and slope, through orchard and meadow and cornfield, magnificent, grim, irresistible. But as they come, the Union artillery opens from Cemetery Hill to Little Round Top, tearing great gaps in the ranks, but still they come on. The southern portion of this assault is coming directly at the Vermonters. The first Vermonters to give way are the 16th Regiment, way out there along the Emmitsburg Road. Wheelock Vasey wrote of his men, they retired in good order. Like hell they did. They turned around and ran. And when they got back to Cemetery Ridge, they came in behind the 14th and 16th Regiments. On came Pickett's charge, closing on the Vermonters. At 200 yards, Colonel William Nichols ordered his 14th Vermont to rise from out of the ravine and open fire. The instant that they opened fire, the Confederates turned, and they're no longer coming at the Vermonters, they're moving north. They're moving toward the copse of trees in that direction. Colonel Nichols always thought it was the rising up of his men that turned the whole charge. Nobody could ever convince him different. Nonsense. They were closing in to the north. For about 2 minutes, the 13th, 14th, and 16th Vermont had wonderful shots at men in the flank. And then after about 2 minutes, there's nobody in front of them. At that moment, George Garrison Stannard, upon a little knoll, seized the military opportunity of a lifetime, if not of a century, and he sends the word to the 13th and 16th regiments, change, front, flank, forward. That means his regiment is going to swing out like a great door from the main Union line to face the right flank of the Confederates. He leaves the 14th in place because he can see another group of Confederates gathering. The Vermonters, under fire, execute this movement perfectly. And they get swung out. There are 900 men in line, and they reach almost to the Cadore farm. They fire, and then they advance, and they stop and fire, and advance and stop and fire. And we understand today that they got off about 12 rounds, and by the time they had finished, they were at point-blank range with the Confederates. 900 rounds. A perfect display would have been some 10,000 rounds delivered into that mass of men, that poor mass of men, struggling up the slope in front of the angle, the copse of trees. Finally, Wheelock Vasey and Francis Voltaire Randall step in front of their regiments and say, "Enough, men, enough," and stop the slaughter. And the Confederates now are surrendering by the hundreds. But off to the south, Wheelock Vasey in the 16th. Vasey sees another assault coming directly at the 14th Vermont. His men are out there capturing prisoners. He gets them in line somehow. They do an about-face and attack this second Confederate onslaught, 1,500 men. And the second Vermont flank attack succeeds. And once more, the prisoners are brought in. The Union commanders were astounded. Abner Doubleday, watching the performance of his 9-month men, kept shouting over and over again, glory to God, see the Vermonters go at it." For all intents and purposes, Pickett's charge had been destroyed. On the 4th of July, the rains poured down on Gettysburg, and the 9-month soldiers were assigned the task of burying the dead. The 12th Regiment went home. Its 9 months were all up. But the 13th and the 16th began to march south, with Meade's army pursuing Lee, although a bit late. The 13th marched to Middletown, Maryland, and there they received orders to halt. Their enlistments were up. They were to camp the night there and then head east, going home. They camped that night and had a party, and they sang John Brown. And the next morning, they stood by the roadside waiting to march. The other way, the Army of the Potomac was passing by, and who should come by but the 1st Vermont Brigade? Their friends and cousins, brothers. The 1st Vermont Brigade fell out and congratulated the 2nd Vermont Brigade on their achievement at Gettysburg. They were heroes of the nation all of a sudden. And then the old brigade, the 1st Vermont Brigade, went tramping down that dusty road to Mine Run. That road would bring them to Wilderness and Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor and Cedar Creek and Winchester and finally to Petersburg and Sailors Creek and Appomattox. But the 2nd Vermont Brigade went home by boat up the Connecticut River to Hartford, where they were greeted as heroes. In Springfield, the women came out with flags and food. And the 2nd Vermont Brigade went home and quietly resumed their lives. Oh, there was a big effort made to get them to re-enlist in the final Vermont Regiment, the 17th Vermont. But most of them said no. They said no because if Gettysburg is glorious and wonderful, it is also was a horrible experience. They had seen the worst of war. Those that did sign up again, many of them ended up at the crater at Petersburg, and many were killed. In 1889, the 2nd Vermont Brigade came to Gettysburg to erect and dedicate their monuments. A highlight was a poem read by Julia Dorr, the Vermont Poet Laureate, brother of Edward Hastings Ripley, commander of the 9th Vermont. Her poem concluded, "O beautiful one, my country, thou fairest daughter of time, today are thine eyes unclouded in the light of faith sublime. No thunder of battle appalls thee, for thy woe has found release. From the graves of thy sons steals only this one soft whisper, peace." Many years later, Ralph Orson Sturdivant of the 13th Vermont wrote an 800-page history of the 13th Vermont Regiment, which I, of course, use mightily in my book on Gettysburg. As an old man one day, he was walking on the streets of his hometown of Stoughton, Vermont, and he met an old friend from the 13th Vermont, James Judkins. Sturdivant remembered of that meeting. He is an old man, 85 years past, and yet he walks off just as when he appeared on the march, quick, steady, and strong. I saw him here in Swanton only a few days ago, and his memory of the old days was fresh, and life in the Army was spoken of with pleasure. And when I remarked to him, "We shall soon pass away and be forgotten," "Yes," said he, "but what we did will remain, and for us it does not matter." I'm an old boxing fan, and I know that most fighters that score knockouts precede them with a lot of punches, jabs and hooks, uppercuts. I think that the telling blow, the final blow to Pickett's charge was delivered by the 2nd Vermont Brigade, and the Confederates said it was the fire from the right that they couldn't stand. It gives me to think along these lines. If the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton, was the Battle of Gettysburg won on the village greens of Vermont? In 1862, when the 9-month units formed, a poet named Gibbon wrote some verse in their honor, which I've always thought served the Vermonters well. I'll close with it. If you look up all our valleys where the glowing harvest shine, you may see our sturdy farmer boys fast forming into line, and children at their mothers' knees are pulling at the weeds and learning how to sow and reap against their country's needs. And a farewell group stands weeping at every cottage door. We are coming, Father Abraham, 300,000 more, shouting the battle cry of freedom. Thank you for listening. I have a few minutes for questions if anyone has them. Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing.
When you say thank you. When you say the 2nd Vermont, you mean the 2nd Vermont Regiment or a brigade?
The 2nd Vermont Brigade, made up of the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th regiments. Yes.
I see. Thank you.
The 2nd Vermont Regiment was part of the 1st Vermont Brigade. Yes.
Oh yes. Well, thank you. I'm the fellow who, when he was 16, went away from home for the first time, and I met one of the 68 Civil War veterans then living, James M. Lurvy of Goffs Falls, New Hampshire. He was 101 and a half. I was 16. And my ambition then was to meet a Civil War veteran. I met him again in April of 1950. He was one of the last 50 alive, and he became, I didn't know it at the time, but it came out that James M. Lurvy, was the last living soldier veteran of the Battle of Gettysburg. And I have a set of cards telling about it. Professor J. Hoare from the University of Maine at Farmington, professor of English for 40 years. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. I saw one veteran of the Civil War when I was a child in Woodstock, Vermont, which was a wealthy town, not yours truly, but the black servants of wealthy families gathered every Sunday afternoon by the ball field for a big party. And always sitting in the center was a wizened little old man that everybody seemed to defer to. I now learned that he was then about 105, 54th Massachusetts. Anyone else?
I have a question about the monumentation here of the brigade. One of the monuments, I think it's the 14th, says basically our monument's out of place. It should be down there in Cadore Thicket. Do you know anything about the history of the monumentation of the regiments here?
Yes, I do. Incidentally, I'll get back. Captain Brown, who was deprived of his weapons on the march to Gettysburg, went into battle without any weapons, but he did pick up a hatchet from the ground and threatened a Confederate colonel with it and got his sword. When it came time for his regiment to put up its monument at Gettysburg, the 13th, the Monument Commission said no. That would be insubordination. Go to the 13th Regiment monument today, you'll see that hatchet by his foot. There's difficulty with the Vermont monuments up there because I mentioned that they were moved forward into a ravine. Well, Hancock Avenue filled that ravine in. So those monuments are probably back a bit from where the regiments were positioned. So it isn't always accurate. But if you go out in the field across Hancock Avenue, you'll find small monuments that mark the positions of the Vermonters before they swung out like a great door. Anyone else? All set?
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening.